and welcome to my latest video. This time we're looking at Naeve Blacktalon, which is a special character for the Stormcast Eternals, I think, from Games Workshop. We're going to be specifically looking at her armour. It's going to be a non-metallic metal gold effect, and the colours we're going to use are very similar to the colours from the previous video, which we used on some of the metal trim on Mortarian's armour. There are a few differences in colours, of course they'll be in the video description as well. The main thing is we're not going to be using Troll Slayer Orange. It's because it's specifically gold that I'm going for this time, and the colours might look a bit weird for how you would expect gold to look, because I'm using, lots of people use all sorts of different colours for gold, whereas I've gone for quite simple colours, and then the transitions and things will be achieved with glazing. But quite often you see people using things like Balor Brown or Zandri Dust or things like that, those kind of colours to achieve those gold looks. But I want a very high contrast with strong lighting effect, so that's why I've started off with a base colour for the whole model of Rhinox Hide. You can see how dark it is there, and that will allow me to have a really strong tonal contrast on the model. So we're starting off with the Fire Dragon Bright, and what we're doing is just picking out all the points where the light will hit as the primary light source. Obviously there are going to be secondary light sources painted on as well for secondary reflections, but this is the primary light source, which would be the sun. So you don't have to be incredibly neat while you're applying these light source points. It's quite easy to do. The technique I'm using, I've talked about this before, but I hold the model under the lamp and I just look at where the light hits the model, so it's top-down lighting, and because the model's already been primed and had paint put on it, the paint has a certain there's certain things about the paint that make it shiny, and so you can copy those reflection points on the model. You can see as I apply there almost exactly where the light is hitting the model. There are other techniques that you can use, such as zenithal highlighting, which is to add an airbrush at 45 degrees with light grey or white over the top of a black primed model, which does a similar sort of effect. You have the light direction, the paint, where the paint hits the model with a 45 degree angle will represent how you want the light to hit it. However, because you're not representing light, the properties of the paint as it hits it will be very flat, whereas here, because the base colour that I'm painting on top of is shiny, I get a kind of more realistic look to the reflection points, so it's a bit easier to copy them. However, obviously there are difficulties with this technique as well, because if you move the model a bit, then the reflections will move. So what you can do is take a photo of it and then refer to that as you go along. Of course, if you use the zenithal highlighting technique, then you don't have to worry about that at all. The paint always is where you left it with the airbrush. So I'm not going to move the model too much in the video, because, well, one, I need to keep the model in focus, and two, it allows me to keep the highlight points in the correct position. I'm not going to copy, I'm not going to complete the whole of the armour in this video because it would just take too long. So I'm going to do focus on the chest and the leg, and that'll give you a good idea for how you complete the whole model. Now, I'm only painting the model from one direction at this point. Obviously, if you're painting the whole model, you have to paint it from multiple directions. You can and each time you turn the model, the lighting will shift, which again will be a benefit if you use the zenithal priming technique. The lighting will never shift because you've done it all the way around the model. Whereas in this, you add like 4 or 5 directions, so each time you turn the model, the lighting is different, but then when you look at the model from that direction, it's correct. So even if you turn the model around, the lighting is always correct still. And to a certain extent, your eyes will trick you into thinking that the highlights and reflections are moving as you turn the model anyway, because if you've painted it from 4 or 5 different directions anyway, they will kind of merge together. You can see that I'm still picking up all the colours. So obviously I'm not using the Trollshair Orange. That would be would add too much red to the colour. I want, like I said, I want it to be a non-metallic metal gold. You might think, well, where's the red and gold? Well, you see as the video progresses, the orange effect just gives it a certain sort of rosy glow, but the Usabti Bone sucks all of the warmth out, and as that creates the strongest highlight. Well, no, obviously the white is the strongest highlight, but that's the final dot, like glistening points for the white. But the Usabti Bone covers the majority of the highlight area, and the Yriel Yellow is just to create that little sort of light glow at the white point. It all sounds very complicated, but you'll see in the video as it progresses. I'm jumping ahead a bit there. So one thing you might notice that I'm doing is I'm applying thicker layers of, well, multiple layers of paint to towards the highest areas of highlights. So you can see on the chest in particular how the most prominent parts of the chest armour and the little lightning bolts on it, the paint is stronger there. So it's a kind of a slight transition. It's still very rough painting, but it will make it easier for the transitions towards the end, because you'll have a lighter colour already to paint on. And I want those areas that have got more layers of paint at the moment, they will be obviously lighter as we go along anyway. And it's obviously easier to highlight a light colour than it is a dark colour. When I say, just to clarify that, when I say it's easier to highlight a light colour than it is a dark colour, I mean that it's easy to get to the next stage in the transition, because it's fewer steps in the tone range. And the other reason why I'm using Fire Dragon Bright is because it has very nice coverage. So you can see on the top of the thigh there, that highlight line is very hard right next to the shadowed side of the thigh. Now I'm going to have to work with that a little bit. It won't be in this video because I'm just doing the front facing direction, but when I turn her around to face, so you'll directly face her on, obviously I'll need to do a whole different range of highlights, but I'm doing that in a separate video. So as I say, it's quite rough painting as well. Don't worry about getting it perfectly neat or anything like that, because there's going to be lots of layers of paint going over the top. You may have just noticed there as well that I am using the side of the brush just to catch all the details on the shoulder. It's just to get the paint covering details quickly. You can spend a long time if you want picking up details and things like that, but it's really not worth it when you're going to blend it all in anyway. So there I actually made a mistake. I started to paint the a secondary reflection on the inside of the leg, and at the end of the video I'll ignore that. I think I'll probably paint over it even. Also on this thigh I changed my mind a few times on the type of reflections that I decided to do, which should be quite interesting, but again I'll talk about those as we go along. So what you saw on the bottom or middle to bottom side of the thigh there was a secondary reflection. Now these are things that would be around, in this case it's just a little kind of a reflection from the thigh, from the calf I think, hitting up, because obviously the light bounces off that light point that's at the top of the calf and hits up onto the thigh, underlighting it, or it could even be like ground or all sorts of things around it. And now I'm starting using the Yriel Yellow. And you see this looks really, really yellow at this stage. And you'd be thinking that doesn't look anything like gold. Don't worry about that. You're going to be covering these a lot of this colour with Usabti Bone and also Mournfang Brown. Mournfang Brown is kind of the magic colour for this. You're not going to paint it on directly too much. It's kind of more of a glazing colour, but it brings a wonderful tone. It's got a hint of red warmth to it, so it still works well with the orange, but it kind of tones down that orange brightness as well. The easiest part to paint on non-metallic metals are the curved surfaces and things like that. They give you a lot of area to play with, and there's no details getting in the way of the brush, so it's very easy to get the smooth transitions down. The hard parts are things like the shoulder, the line on the shoulder, because it has all these lines and details on, and you start to get a little bit confused with how the highlight points work. And it's always best to just focus on how the light is hitting the model at those points. You can work around with secondary reflections afterwards, but a lot of the non-metallic effect will work if you just go from the dark colour up to white with all those colour transitions in between and just do the one direction, and then the secondary reflections can all be worked out later. So here I'm using the Usabti Bone. This is a good point for noticing how different colours look when next to different parts of the model. So the lighting on my desk is exactly the same over the wet palette and on the camera at the main screen at the minute where I'm painting the model. Yet if you look on the wet palette, you can see that the Usabti Bone looks quite a dark colour. Yet when I apply it on the model, it looks really, really light, and that's because the model is so dark. It creates a large, a big range of a big tonal range between the light and the dark. Whereas on the wet palette, the Usabti Bone is next to two light colours with the yellow and the white. And it's also on a kind of a dirty white background, so it looks a lot darker. And so it's important to kind of understand these things when you're painting, that colours will be brighter or darker depending on what the colours are surrounding them. And again, that goes back to why I picked the Rhinox Hide as the base colour, because that then gives me a really dark colour to work the lights on, which gives a really high contrast and will mean that I have a very shiny model, or very shiny looking model at the end. So what I'm doing here is using some Rhinox Hide just to soften in some of these transitions. I apologise, not Rhinox Hide, it's Mournfang Brown at the top left, and below that is Rhinox Hide. So here you can see these highlights. I've done the transitions very quickly. You can see the shine effect working. It's not got a lot of the colours in yet that I want, but adding that Usabti Bone and the white has really pulled out some of the things like the yellow and the orange. And really, if you wanted, you could paint the whole model very quickly with a non-metallic effect, just using this without worrying too much about getting perfect transitions and things like that. Although I did say about using the light from the lamp as a reference point, it is also important to remember that you're painting a specific piece. So if the light is too strong in one area where you want to create a focal point, in this case I want the focal point to be her face and chest area, those need to be brighter than the surrounding areas, even if the light from the lamp would suggest differently. So obviously you have that reference point, you can see where the light hits, but you can still make things lighter or darker, and so using the light from the lamp as a guide rather than a hard rule, so you still need to kind of interpret it to make it look how you want it to look. So here I'm using the Yriel Yellow again, just to add a little bit more glow, but again you have to be very careful with how you apply it. If you see on the chest there's a bit too much yellow there already, but that's going to be glazed down. Now that harder bit comes when you start adding these small detailed reflections. Although they're still visible under the lamp, it's easy to miss them, especially once you've highlighted some of the large areas, because then your eyes will kind of play tricks on you, and you've got the dark contrast from the Rhinox Hide base colours next to the really bright paint that's gone all the way up to Usabti Bone, so you might miss some of the small details, such as around the neck guard and things like that. Inside there's going to be small reflections and things that you have to start adding in. Also, if you just notice on the thigh there, I put a little dot. Don't worry too much about that, because the thighs are going to change completely. So I'm using the Ceramite White here just to get the final highlight points on. There won't be the final highlight points at the end, because these all need to be neatened up. I'm just doing this very quickly still, but it's giving me the full tonal range now on the model, so I can then make all the following highlights match these, or be lighter or darker depending, so the model will look how I want. And already there you can kind of see the non-metallic metal effect is working. So I just tidied up a few bits there. You can see on the chest it's a much harder line going under the ridge. Now what you're going to find on the thigh is that because I changed my mind so much, there's going to be lots of layers of paint. This is more of a learning process to see how you can change your mind as you go along paint. So you don't have to do all these stages to end up with the final result, but it does kind of show you the process that I'm going through while I'm thinking about what I'm doing. Also, if you look on my fingers, particularly on my thumb there, you can see that I've been using an airbrush. That's because I airbrushed the Rhinox Hide base colour on. I did that just before starting the video. Obviously, this is paint on my hands. If you notice how I apply the paint with the brush, you'll see they're very fast marks with a small amount of paint on it. And it kind of creates a feathering effect, and it's a quick way of doing transitions. Not perfect transitions, but once you get that paint down, it's easy later on just to add a few glazes, and then it does become a much smoother transition. But it's kind of a way of painting to let me just get the paint down as I'm deciding what to do. So here you can see I'm just again just going through putting that Ceramite White spot down, because it's giving me the full tonal range to work with again. Obviously the thigh at the front and the chest are going to be the main areas where the light is hitting, and because they're so prominent on the model, they need to really be quite bright. You can also see here I'm putting in secondary reflections. Now secondary reflections are much more limited in their tonal range. You don't want them to overpower the main highlights. It's really important, and quite a few people get this wrong. The secondary reflections have to be soft and secondary. Then they're not highlighted to the same effect. They're highlights based on reflections from other light. So it's light bouncing off the floor, light bouncing off other armor parts, and things like that. If you highlight everything to the same white dot all over, it won't work. And you lose the focus of the model. So the limit of these highlights is pretty much the Fire Dragon Bright. In a couple of cases I may use some Usabti Bone just to pick out a few highlights, but even then, once I've used Fire Dragon Bright, I'm going to use the Mournfang Brown and the Rhinox Hide to dull them down until they're quite subtle. You really don't want those secondary reflections fighting with the primary reflections. You can notice on this shoulder as well the little, I think it's the flaming comet symbol. I'm not too sure about the background really, afraid of Sigma, but I assume it's the flaming comet symbol. The colours aren't quite right on that yet. It looks shiny and non-metallic, but I haven't really focused on that since just getting the tonal range down, so there's not really much in the way of yellow on there, and you can see how that makes it look different, which is quite an interesting point to consider as well. If you want different coloured metals, there's no one best colour range for painting gold, and it really depends on the global lighting and the environment, things, just how shiny you want it to be and things like that. If you took, say, a block of silver and a block of gold and you put them next to each other outside, the colours are almost identical. There's just like a slight tinge for the gold. Whereas you put them in softer light and the gold becomes more, put them in yellow light. So what I'm saying is that don't look for, or don't try and look too hard for specific colours that you want for gold, but more consider on how you want that gold to look. There's no perfect paint recipe for painting it. What is very helpful though is to search the internet for reference materials, look at different types of metals because they reflect differently. If it's brushed metal, then obviously it will be duller and have more texture on it. If it's highly polished, it'll have much more reflection detail on, and those reflections will be bigger. Also depending on where you want the light, how bright you want the light to be hitting it, things like that. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I want this to be very bright and shiny. With high contrast. Now, one thing you'll notice on the thigh when I go along is that, well, at the moment, that little reflection near the knee works quite well. It has some yellow and some Usabti bone mixed in there, and it's quite wide, and like I said, the light looks like it's kind of flaring out there because it's quite a big curve at the end of the knee. It's not just a random reflection they've put on. But as I go along, I don't pay attention to that, and towards the end of the video you'll see that I've got these reflections on there, and I've cut that size right down, and it just looks like a white line highlight. And the problem with that is that you lose that Usabti bone and that yellow, and those are quite important, those colours, for the light reflection, because light isn't just white. There's a certain colour to light. And having just that little bit of yellow to it gives it a much greater sense of realism. Now, of course, some of these small areas, it's really hard to do lots of transitions, but while you're glazing, you can kind of add just a bit of colouring and stuff like that. But what I was doing was using the Usabti bone again just to pick out some of the fine details that I've already had previous transitions put on, just to sharpen them up. It's just a case of neatening and picking out edges and things like that. There on the chest you can see, so there's I'm just putting on a little reflection point there. This is light that I'm using reflecting off of that triangular kind of shape that's just above the stomach area, and that's reflecting onto the lower section of the breast on the chest area. You can see, although it's not as strong as the light there, it's still creating that soft little reflection. And again, I've gone back and used the darker colour, I think it was Mournfang Brown, just to soften in these colours again. Just to reiterate, having the secondary reflections as much softer than the primary reflections actually enhances them and makes them look like reflected light, rather than if you go all the way up to Ceramite White and make them too bright. So what I'm using is the Fire Dragon Bright again, and just picking out some of the hard edges on the detail. You have to have a careful balance with which colours you use, because obviously you can't get a lot of transition on a tiny detail. If you do it just purely a Usabti Bone, it's going to look very cold on the reflection, and it might look out of place. But you still want the detail to be picked out, because they're quite hard details still, so there will be quite a strong light coming off of them. Particularly things like little rivets, they tend to catch the light quite hard. You can see that the white paint is slightly thicker than the other paints, and that's so that it gives a very positive finish. Basically so you can see it better. And now I'm going back and using Rhinox Hide and sharpening up the details again. It's a slight back and forth on these bits with highlighting, glazing, and then redefining some of the dark areas again. Especially things like the lightning bolts on the chest, they need to be very sharp. Just putting a little bit more effort into highlighting the neck guard, because it's quite a main focal point on the model, obviously being near the chest and the head. If you look to, well, you can't see it at the moment very well, but to the right of the neck guard will be quite a dark shadow, and that helps to get that contrast thing that really adds to the shine. You can just see there, so you see this second reflection on to the right of the neck, and on the left you've got that bright highlight point there. this is the lower section of the upper chest guard, so it just curves around over the top of the stomach. It's very small actually on the model. I'll move on to the lightning bolt there, but just to go back to the that lower chest section, well, you can see it clearly on the video there. So on the lower section of that, it's like a small tick just below the breast area. I had to make my own lighting a little bit there, so you can see there's a transition from the dark spot at the bottom going and softening into a transition, and then a line right on top of that dark spot. That's to kind of artificially create a reflection there, with the light catching the edges and things like that. You couldn't see things like that in using the light from the lamp hitting the model, but as you can see in the video there, it still works nicely. So sometimes for these secondary reflections and things like that, you just have to kind of guess how you want it to be. I'm using the Rhinox Hide just to sharpen up that edge on the front of the neck guard. It's really important on those sharp edges that the paint is sharp. Because obviously it's supposed to be a metal item, so the edges really do define what the material is. And here I'm using the Mournfang Brown to tone down that secondary reflection again. So as I was talking about earlier, I painted it using the Fire Dragon Bright, then it's toned down again using the Mournfang Brown. Now here, this is quite interesting. If you look at the wet palette, you can see that I've added a lot of water to 4 of the colours there, which is the Rhinox Hide, the Mournfang Brown, Fire Dragon Bright, and the Usabti Bone. And it's kind of a mix there, so the paint's pooled out. And what this is doing is giving me the option of using kind of a glaze. So the water pools at one point when it's much more heavily mixed. It's probably 4:1 water at those points. Yet the other section of the paint pool is still fairly dry, so I can jump between picking glaze and thicker paint. Now it's not obviously ideal. If you were just going to do pure glazing, it's much better to have a well palette with a large amount of paint, but because it's just small areas that I'm glazing, there's no need to mix all that paint up for it. So in this section of the video, it's going to be mainly focused on the thigh, because as I was saying earlier, I changed my mind quite a bit on it. And what I end up doing is making it very shiny. At this point here, I actually kind of like it now looking back at it, because it fits in probably a little bit more with what I had in mind, but I just felt it looked a bit boring. So what I actually end up doing is making it almost chrome with how strong the reflection is, and adding a horizon line going straight down it. Although it's not really a horizon line, it's more like it's just a reflection point really, because obviously a horizon line would be horizontal, but this is just like a reflection, like a hard reflection on it. And part of that comes around actually because of the central line highlight that I've got in the middle of the thigh, and I kept thinking, do I want to do lots of small reflections on there and then glaze them all together, or do I just want to make it one large highlight kind of similar to the chest? But because the thigh is so much bigger than the chest, it looks very boring. It'd just be one transition from light to dark, and then kind of kept going backwards and forwards between what I wanted. And the problem is, if you haven't decided on how you want it to look and you keep painting it, you're not really making good progress. But because I was recording this for you, I needed to come up with a solution. So this is probably not a good thing to do with your own personal painting, because there's a good chance that you won't be satisfied with the result. So it's always best to have a picture in your head of how you want the painting to look, and then to work towards that, and use reference if you want, and that kind of thing. Whereas what I'm doing here is just making it up as I'm going along, because like I said, I couldn't decide about whether to just have it, the whole thing highlighted as one transition, or to add all these smaller transitions in. This is where I start to think a hard reflection thing, which again could be anything, could be someone throwing a spear at it or anything, but it's a hard reflection on the armour, so it does appear on that. You can see things like this on curved metals. If you find like you've got a metallic kettle or something like that, just go and look at the reflections in it. There's lots of lines going straight up and down. Now I'm just adding a little bit of detail to it just to make it a bit more interesting. Adding these highlights here, just right next to the hard Rhinox Hide line, helps it to pop out more, gives it much more impact. That line there that I'm now softening in now doesn't work very well with that hard reflection line, so I have to now soften it down much more and put and make the second reflection go all the way down around the thigh. And again, I'm using that quick feathering technique that I mentioned earlier, where you just put a small amount of paint on the brush, wipe it off a bit, and then quickly use the side of the brush to apply it. I want that top section of the thigh to be really, really bright. So obviously I'm using quite a large amount of Ceramite White at the topmost part, and then to again emphasise the hard reflection point in the middle of the thigh, I use the Ceramite White dots in there as well. Then you can see, as I was talking about, the really watered down Usabti Bone, so it's like a glaze, and this all around and start softening in these transitions, because obviously with not being able to make it in my mind and keep doing these different techniques on it, I haven't made a very good job of doing a good transition there. You can see some banding. Just really putting in that secondary reflection now under the thigh. And there you can see now from the correct angle how it works properly. There's always a slight issue if you look at models upside down. It can make the paint look a bit weird. So while you're focusing on transitions and things, if you're painting it at one angle, obviously my angle's a little bit different from the camera angle here, so it's still looking fine to me, but from the camera angle you can see faults in the paintwork that aren't visible when you look at the model straight on. So it's starting to work quite nicely now with that reflection line on there. One thing to note though is I'm not going to carry that kind of reflection on to most of the model. I may put it in certain parts on the legs just to keep it consistent, but I'm using it more as an interesting detail. I don't want that kind of strong shine to overpower the whole model. So here, what I did was I pulled the white down too much. I'm making this white line too strong. And you'll see there's an image at the end of the video where I've tweaked it a little bit more. This is the end of the video. For this stage of the armour anyway, I will be doing another one to carry on a bit more. And there's the final shot with the bottle has been had a few more glazes put on to soften it up. I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you for watching.